very much. Wolfgang, it's really my pleasure to congratulate you. I am so pleased that you had the Yidan Prize Award this year. I've been following your work for many years, and it has helped me understand how education has shaped our world in so many ways, and more importantly, to inspire me and my colleagues to think about how the decisions we make today about education can shape the future. So I owe you a big debt of gratitude, and thank you. We have a big task today. We have 30 minutes to introduce you and some of your ideas. Given the sheer volume and depth of your work, that is a huge thing, so let's get to it. Tell me, first of all, what made you interested in working in education?
Well, first, thank you for your kind words, and I'm really deeply honored by this prize. To answer your question directly, if I think back to my childhood, I really did not start out as a friend of education. Quite the opposite. When I get to the transition from kindergarten, which was playful and easy, to elementary school, to primary school, was probably the toughest transition in my life because it was a very strict school and we had to sit still all day with the hands flat on the table in front of us, and we were even punished with a stick if we didn't adhere to this. And even worse, it sort of tried to kill the fantasy. I was a very fantasy-full and spontaneous child. And I was fortunate then to go to a much better secondary school. And when at the age of 16, it was a very humanistic, classical language school. I finally had some air under my wings and became autonomous. I also became the editor of a student newsletter that we produced for the other students. And I've looked it up recently. The first article ever that I published at the age of 16 had a rather provocative title, particularly in this audience. It was called "Primary Education, a Crime on Children." Because I hated primary school so much. And I also cite this because it really shows that my learning since then has been entirely based on scientific insights and evidence and data rather than a positive preoccupation with education. So then also early, still in secondary school, I learned about this famous book, The Limits to Growth, which came out in 1972, which was the first sort of computer-based mathematical model of the future of our world, energy supply, population growth, pollution, climate change started to come up as a topic there. And at that point, I decided that this is really what interests me most. I was doing mostly historical studies. I was learning ancient Greek and so on, but I really wanted to attack these future challenges in a mathematical, modern scientific way. And so I decided of these many topics that really demography, which is defined as the mathematics of people, of populations, of groups of people, was the right focus, the right entry point into this. And from there, then, to really having these insights of education being a key variable, it took me another 20 or more years. It comes really out of scientific interdisciplinary modeling, and I did this in the context of this institute with the difficult name that you heard, International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. This institute was founded in 1972 also as the only collaboration between then the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and the US and the Western countries. This was the height of the Cold War. And there was the feeling that, at least for some of these big global issues, we need to have the East and the West work together. And this remains up to this day the main mission of this institute. Now, the East being largely China and Eastern Asia, building scientific bridges, sometimes also called science diplomacy. But we did this through the means of computer modeling of the future. And there, over the times when I was always trying to sort of structure the human population, not only by age and sex, but by other dimensions, and one of these dimensions being educational attainment, it turned out, first surprisingly to me, and then I did lots of sensitivity analysis, that whatever way you put it, as soon as education was included in the models, it turned out to be the single most important trigger of positive developments. And that was sort of the scientific evidence that starting out as an enemy of basic education, I now came a great supporter and thought that this is really the most important thing.
So I've been looking for that landmark paper on the web, but I haven't found it yet,
It's
so I
not
need a
published on
copy of
the
that.
web. I have a very bad hard copy that I can show.
So tell us, the discipline of demography, how does that inform our notions of economic growth and social change?
Yeah, well, demography, as I said, is the mathematical, quantitative study of changing population size and compositions. Important compositions in plural. You may remember that up until the 1960s, 70s, the main concern was with population size. There was always talking about the population explosion, population bomb. And then when it turned out that really population didn't, I mean, there was lots of analysis. One influential study by the US National Academy of Sciences that concluded that population growth and size may be relatively neutral with respect to economic consequences. And then the emphasis shifted more to population age structure. Then many people talked about population aging and the demographic dividend through changing age structure. But this was when we had only population projections by age and sex. Now, at YASA, we developed these multidimensional demographic models where we had additional dimensions, such as educational attainment or labor force participation. And so what we are doing is really utilizing the fact that a human life is these days about 80 years in most countries, or at least 70 in some. So if we know, let's say, for instance, how many women at the age of 20 have completed secondary education, we have a good handle to forecasting how many 60-year-old women there will be 40 years into the future who will have secondary education, just adjusting for differential mortality by level of education and some of the migration. Otherwise, it is already on the table. So seeing how populations change with the better educated cohorts in many cases, moving up the age pyramid every year being 1 year older, slowly but steadily and in a predictable way changes the educational composition of the population. So demonstrating this quantitatively, and also we have these moving age pyramids that you may have seen in some of the movies. This is really a very powerful way of talking about the future, and it's probably the one social science aspect that has the strongest predictive power for many years into the future.
And I think behind that is some pretty deep thinking about how education changes us as a human being.
Yes, of course, all this data that we have by changing educational attainment over time, we could also reconstruct it. Like if you go to the Wittgenstein Center homepage, you find this data explorer, which gives you for all countries in the world the educational attainment distribution since 1950 by age and gender. And this sort of consistently reconstructed data allows you to also quantitatively, econometrically, if you want, estimate the benefits of education, not only in economic growth terms, that's what many economists are studying, and Rick Hanushek, who got the prize 2 years ago, has really done some of the most fundamental work, but we also look at the consequences on health, on the quality of governance, and in this case now also resilience to already unavoidable climate change. Of course, we didn't have much of the climate change in the past, so we looked at natural disasters and vulnerability to natural disasters.
And Wolfgang, we're here in Asia, one of the regions of the world that has just experienced spectacular growth in the last 40 years. Economists often talk about a demographic dividend. Can you explain this to it? What is the demographic dividend, and what have your studies added to the economist's notion of that dividend?
Okay, well, the demographic dividend is a notion that is used by politicians now and widely in many different contexts. The original definition, as it was done by some demographers and economists from Harvard, was that once we, as I said, the understanding grew that the changing population size is rather neutral. Then we looked at what is the benefit of declining birth rates that results in a reduction of the younger population, meaning a reduction of what we call the youth dependency, and a relatively higher proportion of the population being in working ages. And there is empirical evidence that this did indeed correlate with economic growth. But once we also factor in now the educational attainment, it really shows that the improvement in education really dominates this economic effect. And sort of the way I like to define the demographic dividend these days is that whenever the proportion of the population that is more productive is relatively larger, meaning they are part of the labor force, they are working, and they are also better educated, which enhances their productivity, that gives a boost to economic growth. So it's not just the age structure, but it is also the education and labor force composition that facilitates this demographic dividend. And that's what we've seen in East Asia since the 1960s, where we had this rapid fertility decline combined, or actually preceded by a rapid expansion of education, and in particular female education matters here. So if you look at the education pyramid for countries like Korea, for instance, or China, was in the 1960s, was the majority of the female population was still in red, we put it here, without any formal education, mostly illiterate. And then just very rapidly, the young cohorts, the young generations were better educated, but it took some time until these better educated cohorts or age groups moved up the age pyramid. And we can clearly show that when these better educated cohorts of people moved into the main working ages, that's when we had the most rapid economic growth.
It's been a whole generational shift in capabilities.
It's the generational replacement that surely, in a predictable way, changes societies and brings this economic benefit.
And you've mentioned girls' education a few times. Tell us, beyond being an obvious human right, why is the education of girls and women so important, or so much?
There are several aspects. The one, of course, as you just mentioned, is really as a basic human rights. There's a gender perspective and a rights perspective. But if you leave that aside for a time and look at sort of the macroeconomic or demographic consequences, it is very clear that female education, much more than male education, is a determinant of the fertility level of the birth rates. Is at the end the women who decide how many children they want to have. We see actually if the man gets more educated, the husband and the wife less so, they still have rather big families. Because it's the women who bear the children and also have the health risks or the burden associated with having children. And almost every woman who is more empowered and can say that herself how many children she wants fewer children, but a better future for those children who she has. So that is the one. And then there are many other aspects. For instance, family health. Not only infant mortality, but the health of the entire household is really, we show empirically, it's the woman who has the biggest influence on nutrition, on healthcare, on everything you do in the household. And then there is another multiplier effect of female education, because still in almost all societies of the world, the women are more deeply involved in early childhood development, looking after the young children. And we increasingly understand how important early childhood development is for the future cognitive and emotional and all kinds of development of the children. So again, here it is the female education that matters so much.
And we were talking yesterday a bit about the maybe disproportionate benefits of educating any child who is marginalized, as our previous panel was.
Yes, of course, if the marginalized population, they matter sort of in a dual way. First, if we manage to empower them through education, they can make a positive contribution to society, to the economy, and everything. But if we leave them behind, particularly in societies also like in Europe, where we do have a sophisticated welfare system, they actually also become a burden. So it really makes so much sense to invest, particularly also in the empowerment of these less privileged groups.
And one interesting finding on the work on gender was that a mother's education matters more for a child's survival than income or wealth.
Yes, this has been sort of a favorite topic of mine, because many economists just tend to think as a starting point that it's income that matters for almost everything. It's sort of the basic underlying variable. And so we had a series of studies because we do have now good data both on the education and the income side, and then look at different outcomes, such as child mortality, but also adult life expectancy. You may not know that the differentials for adult life expectancy, for instance, is on average 7 to 8 years between the more highly educated and the lower educated groups. In some countries like Russia, it's even 12 years. And the differentials are much stronger for educational differentials than they are for income differentials. Of course, income and education are closely interwoven, and many economists think that there's too much endogeneity in the system to try to differentiate. Well, actually, this delayed effect of education, it gives you a statistical handle for separating the effects. Because if you have, say, a 50-year-old man or woman being in better health and being economically more productive, it does not immediately, higher income does not immediately help with the current education of the person. The education took place 30, 40 years before. So this time lag in the effect of education really helps you to sort out this different effects of income and of education. And we had a series of articles that we summarized into sort of a headline: when it comes to survival, mind matters more than money. So what is in your brains is more relevant than what is in your pocket.
Yeah, great. Maybe to switch topics a bit, we talked a lot about resilience throughout this conference. You've done some really fascinating work on climate change. And we know the climate is changing, we know societies are changing, but you're trying to link the two concepts together. So you talk about modeling climate change requires an understanding of both dynamics.
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Well, as I told you, when I came back with a PhD in demography from the US, I happened to be able to work at this International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis outside Vienna, which also is one of the world's leading centers of the study of climate change as well as of biodiversity, water. So it's really a strong focus on the environmental aspects. I was then working in the population program, and then for more than 20 years headed the world population program. So simply by virtue of being at that institute, every lunch or whenever we met for seminars, we started to talk with our colleagues on the climate change side. So we jointly then with a climatologist already in 2001, I published a book on population and climate change. So this was a very fruitful interaction, because up to this day, sort of the social development, socio-economic development community is quite distinct and separate from the environmental and climate change research community. So at YASA, we managed to put this together, and it came to me when the consequences of climate change are being assessed. Let's give an example. The World Health Organization, a clearly highly reputable international organization, has put up a report on the consequences of climate change in Eastern Africa, estimating how many additional malaria deaths there would be in 2070 under conditions of climate change. And there are climate models that give you meaningful numbers in terms of temperature, precipitation, and the climate in 2070. But what they then did, they matched it with today's populations, with today's public health capabilities. That makes, of course, no sense. If you have the climate of the future, you need to match it with the likely society, the likely population of the future. And when I asked them why they did this, they said, well, we don't have any don't have any numbers that we can match, so they rather take today's population. Well, we in the Wittgenstein Center now do have these scenarios where we have projection scenarios by age, sex, and level of education. And education being such a powerful determinant also of public health and of the capabilities of societies to cope with, also to the resilience to climate change. We use these scenarios, and of course that looks less dramatic if we assume that, let's say, Kenya in 2070 will have a health system that is comparable to some of the European systems today, And then, of course, there will be many fewer malaria deaths than if you match the climate of 2070 to the population of today.
And you wrote another article with a provocative title called Fund More Teachers Rather Than Engineers.
Okay. Yeah. Now, this was the idea that we now have at YASA developed sort of a set of scenarios that are now widely used by the international climate change research community. We call them the SSPs, the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways. Shared because now this is a consortium of many different modeling groups. We decided to have a joint set of scenarios that capture the socioeconomic challenges for both climate change mitigation, which is sort of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also climate change adaptation, which is adapting and reducing vulnerability to already unavoidable climate change. So what we did is we matched some climate change scenarios with different of the futures in terms of socioeconomic development. And again and again, taking data. Of course, we don't know yet the real impacts of climate change, but we know for today's disaster vulnerabilities to hurricanes, flooding, even earthquakes, although they are not directly climate change related. We do have quite good documentation and see how education has been a protective force for the vulnerability. And so we published this in Science magazine that really in a policy forum they're saying that showing that some of the more rapid socioeconomic development scenarios, particularly driven by rapidly expanding education, really there are fewer disaster-related deaths to be expected than under lower education scenarios. And it was then really the editors, actually, of Science magazine who put this subtitle, Fund More Educators Rather Than Just Engineers. And I got many angry calls from engineers responding to this, but we said not only engineers, because the background is that of these billions and billions that are now being spent on climate change adaptation. You may have just heard the COP29 in Azerbaijan has agreed to at least increase this to some extent, not as much as the developing countries had hoped, but there is billions and billions every year now on the table for support on climate adaptation. But virtually all the money goes into engineering projects, building seawalls, bringing something that is concrete in the dual sense of the meaning, like putting concrete structures up there. And our point is, even though we don't know exactly what kind of climate-related challenges will be there, it makes much more sense to empower people through education to then flexibly react to what the challenges are. And that is the background for this. Of course, there need to be an engineering project, but we also need to be aware and invest in education as a force of adaptation.
Okay, I think you just saved yourself. I caught the eye of an engineer and educator in the audience here. But you summarize this hard versus soft adaptation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, it's because the borders are not really clear what is hard and what is soft adaptation. But the thing is that, anything that is sort of cast in stone and will stay there for long may. I mean, there are many instances now shown also that seawalls actually can do in the long run more harm than good. And if we have sort of, in a clever way, have sort of new mangroves planted along the coastal lines, together with early warning systems and better information systems, that can be, even from a hard perspective, be the better solution through this software.
And you're deeply involved in the IPCC and the climate discussions. How do they receive this argument on the soft skills and the skills and the abilities of kids to
as you may know, there are these IPCC reports, this International Panel on Climate Change. They have just recently published the 6th assessment report, which includes thousands of scientists from all around the world in 3 very thick volumes. I was part of the 5th assessment report before, and it was really clearly, if you look at the 3rd and 4th assessment report, they almost exclusively focused on these hard factors. Now this vulnerability resilience community has become much more powerful and informed. So if you look at the fixed and particularly the sixth assessment report, they give much more weight now to this social development, reducing in vulnerability, and skills-based adaptation.
So, okay, I want to go back quickly to the shared socioeconomic pathways. I wish we had a screen because if you look forward to 2050, your 3, 4, 5 scenarios are dramatically different in terms of the education level of the population and the size of the population itself. Can you maybe give us a brief overview of those pathways, but more importantly, talk about what some of the decisions that we can take today as leaders in the world could do to tilt the odds of achieving a more optimistic scenario?
Yeah, let me start with that overall the prospects for climate change are becoming increasingly pessimistic. You know about the Paris targets of keeping climate change below 1.5 degrees, and we are already now at the 1.5 degrees. But that is sort of, they say, if possible, but by all means keep it below 2.0 degrees. But even that increasingly looks unlikely, with many major countries even sort of curbing back their efforts. And the new Director General of EASA is one of the leading climate scientists, John Schellenhuber. He just published that he thinks that even implementing the measures that are now promised, that are sort of not yet implemented but promised, will still go up to 2.7 degrees, if not 3 degrees. And that, of course, will have dramatic consequences. Like a tenth of a degree doesn't sound that dramatic, but there are all these reinforcing effects, these tipping points. And humanity is really there at the decisive stage. And we probably will have to rely on sort of negative emissions towards the end of the century, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, if we have the technology by then. But the determinants of both the mitigation and the adaptation is so much depending on what the political will of the countries is, but also what the individual behavior of people are. And there are so many studies recently that have shown that education really helps to empower people to have despite all of the short-sightedness of policies, you can see that more educated people are more flexible to personally switch to less energy-consuming behavior using public transportation and so on, and also have the pressure on the political system to do something about it. And as I said, we will have significant climate change that is hardly avoidable, and then sort of the adaptation kicks in. And here the SSB shows that really changes in the near term, let's say in improving education, in improving some of our systems of reporting, and that makes big impacts in the longer run. So it really matters what happens in the near-term future, because there is a big momentum until those measures become active.
So it's not just on climate change, it's on the broader range of SDGs as well, right? I think you've said that education is the first principle in achieving the SDGs.
Yes, by all means, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has appointed me to be one of the 15 experts to produce the Global Sustainable Development Report by the UN, the first quadrennial report after the SDGs. And in this report, which is called The Future is Now, we do show that the SDGs, they are sort of rather particularized. They have many different goals, partly overlapping, partly even contradicting. And we have to look at the sort of the big goals and the big forces behind the whole idea of joint sustainable development. And there again and again, education comes out as a key.
And what's your assessment of the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals so far and the prospects of achieving them? And given these, especially the thinking about the crises in education that we've discussed in the world.
Now, unfortunately, we are very much behind on almost all of the 17 SDGs, and you may know there are 169 more specific targets. Under the huge majority of these, we will fail by 2030 to reach them. But there's even a danger if you say we are failing completely, then people lean back and say, well, there's just nothing we can do. Of course, we have to show the pathway, how we can still go about. And the big discussion at the moment is whether the Sustainable Development Goals will just simply be extended. We can't reach them by 2030, maybe we can reach them by 2040 or so, or whether we have a sort of a new paradigm. And at YASA we published last year a big report that we called Systems Analysis for Sustainable Well-Being. And this may be a new notion on the table, that the goal, after all, is not development in a more conventional sense, but the well-being of the people, but also the well-being of nature, but in a sustainable way. So that may be a new paradigm. I'm not sure. I don't think it'll be ready by 2030, but maybe in the longer-term future, that could be the goal.
But I think, one of the takeaways I have from your work and from Alicia's speech this morning is that that's on us, right? It's on us to make those decisions now to shape the future by giving people the skills, the capabilities, and the power to determine and shape the world that they want.
Yeah, very much so. For whatever indicator or whatever trend we look, is the near-term future matters a lot. We just cannot afford to wait. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.